While Caesar was wintering in Cisalpine Gaul, frequent rumors were brought to him, and dispatches also from Titus Labienus informed him that all the Belgae, whom we have already described as a third of Gaul, were conspiring against the people of Rome and giving hostages each to the other. You know, when you start winning and leveling up, other people are going to take notice and want to get rid of you. This is the story of Caesar's second year campaigning in Gaul, when exactly that happened. And we're going to see how Caesar and his men act when they are really on the edge in this episode. And of course, this is all straight from the pen of the man himself. Before we go on, I want to give a shout out to our very generous sponsor for this episode, Dr. Richard Johnson, an avid Cost of Glory listener who loves great heroes and Caesar in particular. Thanks, Richard. Now, before we get to the war part of this book, one of the things that I find so amazing about Caesar's conquest of Gaul is how many other things he was also doing at the same time. We'll get to his literary activities later on. But you may have noticed with that opening quote, Caesar said he's wintering in Cisalpine Gaul. He's got his troops in Gaul proper, actually outside of his province. We'll get to that in a moment. So Cisalpine Gaul, where he is, though, is really northern Italy, north of the Po River, the Padanus River, as the Romans called it. And here's how Plutarch describes what Caesar is doing there. Again, the year is 57, early in the year, still winter. Quote, this is Plutarch, Caesar left his forces among the Sequani to spend the winter, while he himself, desirous of giving attention to matters at Rome, came down to Gaul along the Po, which was a part of the province assigned to him. That's Cisalpine Gaul. Here Caesar fixed his quarters and carried on his political schemes. Many came to see him, and he gave each one what he wanted, and sent all away in actual possession of some of his favors, and hoping for more. And during all the rest of the time of his campaigns in Gaul, unnoticed by Pompey, he was alternately subduing the enemy with the arms of the citizens, or capturing and subduing the citizens with the money which he got from the enemy. End quote. So Caesar's there doing deals. He's meeting with his agents and his political network, visiting him from Rome. Yeah, I'll help you out with your bid for the praetorship. Yeah, I've got a lawyer who can handle your case and so on. And oh yeah, take this for your old mother, would you? So, on top of this, he's also got a provincial governor's duty to do, and that will include, notably, holding the assizes, which is kind of like a traveling court of appeals that the governor has to go and hear all these cases, property disputes, tax arrears, lots of minutia, and it's drudgery, but he's also in the process building up a kind of power base, through favors to these local people and a political network in Cisalpine Gaul too, while he's doing that. And he's also doing this work for the province of Illyria and Transalpine Gaul at the same time. I mean, it's an incredible amount of administrative workload that he's got to supervise, even if he can probably delegate a lot of it. Most governors would be satisfied just doing all of that stuff for one province. But Caesar is splitting his time doing all this for three, and meanwhile, executing on his very clear personal mission, as we've stated already, of becoming one of history's greatest conquerors. I mean, just consider the energy of the man. All right, so to the new war brewing with the Belgae. The Belgae are in and around modern Belgium. They're sort of distant neighbors to the north of the Sequani and the Aedui that we were dealing with on the last chapter. We'll get to the Belgae and who they are in a sec, but here's Caesar explaining the big picture of what's going on. The causes of their conspiracy, I'm reading from Caesar now. The causes of their conspiracy, it was said, were as follows. In the first place, the Belgae feared that when all Gaul was pacified, they might themselves be brought face to face with the Roman army. In the second, they were being stirred up by certain of the Gauls, who had either been unwilling that the Germans should stay longer in Gaul and were no less now distressed that a Roman army should winter and establish itself in Gaul, or who for sheer fickleness and inconstancy were set upon a change of rule. and this they could not so readily effect under our empire." End quote. Typical fickle Gauls. So Caesar noted at the end of the last book that he actually left his legions in Gaul among the Sequani and the Aedui when he went back to Italy to do his governor stuff. And the territory of the Sequani and the Aedui, that's pretty far outside the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul. It's east central France. And you could argue that this was reasonable, right? They've just had these wars and pacified some enemies, and, you got to keep some people in place to make sure a lid stays on everything. It's not customary for a Roman general to do this, especially to camp his soldiers out in a region that's not his province, but it's not entirely not done either. But it also, and you got to wonder, did Caesar know this? Surely he knew this. Well, it's kind of a provocation, you could argue. It sends a message to these nearby tribes who aren't currently pacified. Hey, the Romans may be here to stay. So the Belgae decide to take some preemptive action, and they start preparing for war. Not clear at this point in the narrative whether they intend to attack or whether they just want to be ready to defend, but they're taking major actions. They're having councils or exchanging hostages amongst themselves for good faith, and Caesar finds out about all this. And one of the Roman commanders that's forwarding this intelligence to him, by the way, is Titus Labienus. That's basically his second in command in Gaul. Labienus plays an important role later in this episode, in this book. You might also remember him, though, from the life of Pompey. He's a big player in the civil wars, actually. He famously defects from Caesar. But let's stay on course here. So all the Belgae now are convening their leaders and gathering. It's a big tribal confederacy of multiple tribes that will meet shortly. And Caesar takes swift action. He raises 2 new legions in Cisalpine Gaul, and he gets to the borders of the Belgae real fast in the spring. He kind of shocks them. And when he gets there, some emissaries from one of the tribes of the Belgae approach him. These are the Nervii. The Nervii live in what's now northern France. In fact, their capital city is now called the modern city of Reims. That takes its name, in fact, from Remi. It's Rheims. I believe it's Reims in French. It's about 2 hours by car northeast of Paris now in the direction of Belgium. Well, these Nervii, they say, hey, we know about this conspiracy. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We want to help you Romans out. And Caesar accepts, and he makes them allies. They exchange he takes some hostages from them. So these Nervii immediately report to Caesar that the Belgae are even inviting the Germans who live across the Rhine to ally with them against the Romans. So, it's serious, isn't it? And here's how Caesar describes the Belgae. Quote, Caesar asked the Nervii what states were under arms, what was their size and their war strength. He discovered that most of the Belgae were of German origin and had been brought over the Rhine a long while ago and had settled in their present abode by reason of the fruitfulness of the soil, having driven out the Gauls who inhabited the district. And we're actually dealing here with like an ancient origin story that the Belgae tell about themselves. They're actually Gauls and they speak a Celtic language like the other Gauls. But, claiming descent from the Germans, it's possible, but it certainly makes them seem tougher, doesn't it? Going on here. The Belgae, the Nervii said, were the only nation who, when all Gaul was harassed in the last generation, had prevented the Teutones and the Cimbri from entering within their borders. And for this cause, they relied on the remembrance of those events to assume great authority and great heirs in military matters. End quote. So tough guys, these Belgae. And here are some of the tribes of the Belgae that are taking up arms, according to Caesar. And I find it fascinating here. A lot of these tribes have given their names to modern places in France and Belgium. So you've got the Bellovaci, whence the city of Beauvais, named after them, which is about an hour to the north of Paris. These guys have 100,000 men-at-arms that they're contributing to the coalition. Then you've got the Suessiones, whence the city of Soissons, between Beauvais and Reims. And by the way, Napoleon in his commentaries just refers to these various tribes by their modern French names, like the men of Soissons, the men of Beauvais. And so these Suessiones, the men of Soissons, they've got 50,000 fighters. Then there are the Nervii, who are bringing another 50,000 men-at-arms. There's no significant modern place names coming from the Nervii, I think, but Caesar notes that these guys are among the most warlike of them all, and more on them shortly. The Nervii live in what's now Belgium proper, kind of southwest Belgium. Then there are the Atrebates, the men of Artois, as Napoleon puts it. That's, again, Belgium proper, 15,000 from them. Then there are the Ambiani, the men of Amiens, another 10,000. And there's several more Belgian tribes, but notably also 40,000 various German tribes from across the Rhine, too. So it's a pretty big coalition from the sound of it. Caesar's got 8 legions now, something like 50,000 men. The Belgae, some 300,000. And it seems from the text that Caesar here kind of initiates hostilities, but kind of doesn't. Listen to this. Quote, Caesar made a powerful and personal appeal, the wording there is important, to Diviciacus the Aeduan. This is his friend, remember from the last episode, showing Diviciacus how important an advantage it was for the Roman state and for the welfare of both parties to keep the contingents of the enemy apart, so as to avoid the necessity of fighting at one time against so large a host. This could be done if the Aedui led their own forces into the borders of the Bellovaci and began to lay waste to their lands. End quote. So what he's doing here is he gets Diviciacus and the Aedui to attack the Bellovaci's farmlands and harass them. And these guys are a little further afield to the west from the rest of the Belgae. And the wording there, again, is key. He's not commanding the Aedui, but just saying, hey, it would be a good idea and in our mutual interests. So Caesar's got some deniability there. And so the Aedui kind of start this fight with this huge Belgae coalition. That's at least how I'm reading it here. And what do you know? The Belgae respond by attacking a city of the Remi, who are now, as of a few minutes ago, Roman allies. So Caesar's got to respond, right? And this is really clever on his part. You know, he sees there's going to be trouble for sure with the Belgae one way or another. Let's do it on our terms. And so he kind of provokes them into taking a course that would make it justifiable for the Roman commander here to intervene. So that's a pretty good way to start a fight. You know, if you see it coming, find a way to control how it will start. Ideally in a way that gives you some deniability to say, hey, you're just defending yourself or your interests. So the Belgae attack the city of the Remi. Caesar, of course, intervenes. I'll skip the siege that the Belgae launch on the town of the Remi. The barbarians use these tortoise shell formations, you know, shields over the heads. I don't know, maybe it's something they learned from the Romans. And they attack the walls of the town of the Remi, and they don't manage to take them, but it gets pretty close, pretty hairy for the Remi. Caesar manages to relieve them just in time. In this process, though, as he relieves the Remi city, Caesar notes how huge the Belgian army is. Their camp, as he was able to discern from the smoke from the campfires, was some 8 miles across. Amazing. It was, again, something like 300,000 men, according to his report. Wow. And what ends up happening is the Belgae decide to retreat once Caesar relieves his town of the Remi, not least, though, Caesar notes, because the Bellovaci, these are the guys with the largest contribution, 100,000 soldiers, they're really getting anxious as more and more of their farms are being burned by Diviciacus the Aeduan. So that part of the plan worked. The Bellovaci head home. The other Belgae retreat to regroup. But in this mass kind of retreat, Caesar says it seems like a flight. It's so disordered and chaotic. There's chaos crossing a river, and they're leaving in disorder, and Caesar is able to attack and destroy large sections of the Belgian armies. So things seem to be going pretty well at first. Then Caesar goes and he attacks Noviodunum, which is Soissons, the capital city of the Suessiones. And he discovers that it's too well fortified. He can't take it by a quick storm. So he gets the Roman engineering machine operating. And here's Caesar on how that went. Quote, Caesar entrenched his camp, therefore, and began to move up mantlets and to make ready the appliances needed for assault. Mantlets here, just to pause. This could also be translated as roofed sheds. So these are portable shelters that the Romans build as step one of their devastating siege machine, you might call it. But the Latin here is interesting. It's for these mantlets, it's vinea, which means vine. And I think that the idea is that the Romans build these sheds that gradually extend like tendrils of a vine from their camp toward the walls of your city so that the Romans can enjoy the protection from these sheds from your missiles while they build their war ramps and dig tunnels to undermine your walls. And it must have had a pretty terrifying effect, especially when you see them building the siege towers that they're getting ready off out of range to roll up on the ramps that they're building and capture your town. Well, here's how the Suessiones react. Quote, when the mantlets were speedily moved up to the town, a ramp cast up and towers constructed, the Gauls were disturbed by the size of the siege works, which they had not seen or heard of before, and by the rapidity of the Romans, so that they sent deputies to Caesar to treat of surrender. And upon the Remi interceding for their salvation, they obtained their request. End quote. So, tick. Now the Suessiones are down 2. And the Landmark Edition commentator, Kurt Rafflaub, puts it well here. He says, quote, as often it was the speed and efficiency of the Roman preparations and the visual impression created by the siege works, as well as the way the soldiers went about their business with grim and professional determination, that demoralized the defenders. End quote. So all going well, just another routine Roman crackdown here. And in the meantime, Caesar gets to do a solid for his loyal man Diviciacus of the Aedui, who comes to him now. Listen to this. And in this speech of Diviciacus, Caesar drops a little breadcrumb here for something he's got in mind for later. See if you can spot it. All right, quote, Diviciacus, who had returned to Caesar after the Belgae had withdrawn and had dismissed the forces of the Aedui, now spoke on behalf of the Bellovaci as follows. Remember, those are the people that Caesar suggested that the Aedui invade their territory. Here's Diviciacus, though. Quote, the Bellovaci, he says, have always enjoyed the protection and friendship of the Aeduan state. They have been incited by their chiefs. It's always good people and bad leaders, isn't it? So these chiefs who declared that the Aedui have been reduced to slavery by Caesar and are suffering from every form of indignity and insult. And these chiefs incited them both to revolt from the Aedui and to make war on the Roman people. The leaders of the plot, perceiving how great a disaster they have brought on the state, have fled to Britain. Not only the Bellovaci, but the Aedui also on their behalf beseech you to show your customary mercy and kindness towards them. By so doing, you will enlarge the authority of the Aedui among all the Belgae, and on, end quote. So, did you catch it? These bad leaders of the Bellovaci who stirred up the people to join this conspiracy, well, they fled to Britain, that exotic island where Roman standards have never marched. A possible hotbed of discontent, perhaps needing to be addressed. We'll file that one away. So Diviciacus's proposal is essentially the Romans spare the Bellovaci and forgive them for their part in the conspiracy, and then Diviciacus and the Aedui basically get to pick their new rulers from among them, trustworthy men. And Caesar loves this idea. Hey, reward your loyal allies, the Aedui, and then the Aedui get to have the powerful Bellovaci as a sort of client and ally. They get to, pick who's in charge, who are obviously going to be loyal to them. And I think all this points out to you, by the way, just zooming out a sec, how a loose federation of independent states has a big disadvantage against a great power. And this is something that Alexander Hamilton was really insistent upon preventing in the early days of the United States. A lot of people in the various states wanted a weak federal government, less taxes, no standing army, more independence for the 13 colonies. But Hamilton wanted to make a strong central government precisely so that some Caesar, or England or France or Spain, as the case may be, couldn't come in and play the American colonies off of each other, as Caesar does here. And, well, with that, Caesar breathes a sigh of satisfaction. So, now, various tribes of the Belgae and other Gauls are sending emissaries, suing for peace with the Romans. It's looking good. But here's where it starts to get interesting. One tribe in particular, the Nervii, refused to do so. Here's Caesar on the Nervii. On the borders of the Ambiani, the men of Amiens, lived the Nervii. And when Caesar inquired as to the nature and character of these men, he discovered as follows. Traders had no means of access to them, for the Nervii allowed no wine nor any of the other appurtenances of luxury to be imported, because they supposed that their spirit was like to be enfeebled and their courage relaxed thereby. Fierce men they were, of a great courage, denouncing and accusing the rest of the Belgae for surrendering to Rome and casting away the courage of their forefathers. For themselves, they affirmed that they would send no deputies and accept no terms of peace. End quote. Remember, they're already at war, so anything goes now, more or less. And the Nervii have brought along some of their neighbors, too, into resisting. So Caesar gets to work. And he marches several days into the territory of the Nervii, and he sends ahead some scouts to find a good place for a kind of longer-term camp. And he starts marching toward it. Now, he's got in his army at this point a number of the Belgae who had surrendered, and other Gauls, too, marching with him. And some of these, it turns out, are still quietly rooting for the Belgae to defeat the Romans, and they send word to the Nervii secretly. They say, Caesar's column is spread out like a long, weak string. He's got baggage trains separating all the legions. It would be really easy to take him by surprise here. So the Nervii decide to set up an ambush. And note how Caesar sets that whole narrative arc up nicely. He builds some suspense, helps you to understand the Nervii's motivations, their probable strategy. And here's Caesar with more on what the Nervii are getting ready with. Quote, "The plan proposed by those who brought the information was further assisted by an ancient practice of the Nervii. Having no strength in cavalry, for even to this day they care nothing for cavalry, but all their power lies in the strength of their infantry, in order more easily to hamper the cavalry of their neighbors, whenever these make a raid on them, they cut into young saplings and bend them over." So they're kind of terraforming here, bending over these young saplings that then grow sideways. And thus, by the thick horizontal growth of boughs and by intertwining with them brambles and thorns, they contrive that these wall-like hedges serve for them as though fortifications, which not only cannot be penetrated, but not even seen through. End quote. So you've got to imagine the Nervii sneaking around behind these impenetrable hedge walls, scheming as the Romans are marching through, unawares, and they wait until Caesar is setting up his camp before they strike. But first, Caesar's going to describe the topography for you of what turns out to be an epic battle that they're about to fight. He says, quote, "The character of the ground selected by our officers for the camp was as follows. There was a hill inclining with uniform slope from its top down to the river Sambre. This is the Sabis in Latin. From the opposite riverside there rose another hill of like slope over against and confronting the other, open land for about 200 paces at its base, then wooded in its upper half so that it could not easily be seen through from outside. Within those woods, the enemy kept themselves in hiding. On the open ground along the opposite riverbank, a few enemy cavalry posts were to be seen. The depth of the river was about 3 feet. End quote. So Caesar sees a few enemy cavalry across the river where he wants to make his camp, and I guess these must be some of the allies of the Nervii who don't completely ignore the art of horsemanship. And so he sends his cavalry ahead across the shallow river to engage, to chase those enemy cavalry away while he's building a fort on the hill. And the enemy cavalry engage for a while, then they retreat to the forest. Then the Roman cavalry don't follow them. They keep strict discipline. And then the enemy come back out, and then they fade back into the forest. And this goes on for a little while and seems kind of pretty routine here. And there's a key twist here. Caesar says, quote, "However, the arrangement and order of Caesar's column," again, he's speaking in the third person as he always does, "the arrangement and order of Caesar's column was different from the report given by the Belgae to the Nervii. For as he was approaching the enemy, Caesar, according to his custom, was moving with 6 legions in light field order. After them he had placed the baggage of the whole army. Then the 2 legions, which had been last enrolled, brought up the rear of the whole column and formed the baggage guard." End quote. And so in other words, Caesar's not marching with his army all strung out and individual legions' baggage trains stuck between the legions like squishy vegetables on a shish kebab, but rather he had 6 legions, his stronger ones, veteran ones, all in the front, basically ready to fight. They're in light field order, which means, they're not carrying really heavy packs, and they're ready to fight. Then after them, he's got all of the army baggage together. And then the new recruits are at the back defending the baggage train. And if he hadn't done this, that is, if he hadn't been basically ready to fight off the march, well, let's just say world history might have gone very differently. So the Romans, they arrive, hyper-organized as usual. Immediately, straight away, once they get to the hill, they start marking their camp grounds out, measuring off where the walls are going to be and the road, the streets within the camp. They start chopping down trees, digging ditches. And they haven't been at this for very long when the Nervii suddenly strike. And they struck right as the scouts saw the baggage train start to pull up off in the distance. So it hasn't been very long. The Nervii sweep down out of the forest. From the hill on the other side of the river, tens of thousands of men. They completely overwhelm the Roman cavalry who are on the other side of the bank. They chase them back across the river, and then all these men start sprinting up the hill to the Romans, who have already shifted out of soldier mode and into construction company mode. And here's Caesar on what happens next. And his whole battle description here, it gives you a lot of vivid details of how the Romans usually got ready for a battle, but couldn't quite do so on this occasion. Quote, "Caesar had to do everything at once. He had to raise the flag to give the sign to call soldiers to arms, to have the trumpet blow the battle signal, to recall the troops from their entrenching, to bring in the men who had gone somewhat farther afield in search of materials for the ramp. He had the line to form, the troops to harangue, the signal to give. A great part of these duties was prevented by the shortness of the time and the advance of the enemy. So he's not actually able to do all these things. The stress of the moment was relieved by 2 things: the knowledge and experience of the troops, for their training in previous battles enabled them to assess for themselves what was proper to be done as readily as others could have shown them. Remember, these are veterans mostly. And the fact that Caesar had forbidden the several lieutenant generals, the legates he means, to leave the entrenching and their proper legions until the camp was fortified. These generals, seeing the nearness and speed of the enemy, waited no more for a command from Caesar, but took on their own account what steps seemed proper to them." End quote. Okay, so you've got masses of very motivated, tall men coming in hot. Everybody on the Roman side is starting to get very nervous. But the soldiers and officers, they hold their ground. They brace for the attack. Here's what Caesar himself does. Quote, Caesar gave the necessary commands and then ran down to whatever unit happened to be the closest and came to the 10th legion. The trusty 10th. His harangue to the troops was no more than a charge to bear in mind their traditional valor, not to panic, and to bravely withstand the onslaught of the enemy. Then, as the enemy were no farther off than the range of a missile, he gave the signal to engage. End quote. Now, what he says to these men should be pretty obvious to them, right? This is what you should do. Be brave, don't panic. But it really matters that the commander says this. It really matters that they hear it from his mouth. And the words that he uses here, too, are really well chosen. He says, remember your traditional valor. The Latin there is pristina virtus, and that could be translated as ancient manliness. Virtus in Latin, it could be translated as virtue in some contexts, could also be battle prowess, but it's also really the best Latin translation of our concept of manliness. And then the connotations of pristina there, pristine, the traditional and traditional valor. In Latin, pristina there really evokes the ancestral age of Roman Republican greatness, the virtue of the past generations who defeated Hannibal, Pyrrhus, the Cimbri, Teutones, other great enemies. And he's reminding them, he's telling them with those two words who they are, appealing to their identity. It's a very powerful motivator. So they're on this hill as the Nervii and allies attack. And Caesar says, they don't have time to form up a proper battle formation, but each legion is more or less clumped together and they're arranged in a kind of semicircle around the hill, trying to defend only this very rudimentary beginnings of a proper campsite. Caesar runs from the 10th on one side to another legion on the other side. He gives them the same words. He's trying to float above, meanwhile, the formation and see what's needed where. And then he adds, quote, the time was so short, the temper of the enemy so ready for conflict, that there was no space not only to attach their crests and insignia in their places, but even to put on helmets and draw covers from shields. In whichever direction each man chanced to come in from the entrenching, whatever standard each first caught sight of, by that he stood, to lose no fighting time in seeking out his proper company. So, these men are basically linking up and fighting with whatever legion or cohort they happen to find themselves nearest to when the crisis strikes. And those crests and insignia that Caesar talks about, and the shields, these are some of the main visual markers that distinguish, say, a centurion from a private, a tribune from a centurion, a legate from a tribune. There's a sense, of this blending of all the ranks, that we're all in this catastrophic mess together. Think of the kind of whole army camaraderie that this would build for your men, if you manage to survive. Well, as for the battle itself, as Caesar says, given the enormous difficulties, it was only to be expected that the fortunes and outcomes on different parts of the battlefield would vary a great deal. And here's what he means. The 9th Legion and the 10th Legion hurl their spears and they charge down into the Atrebates, the men of Artois, and then they manage to drive them all the way down and back across the river. Titus Labienus is leading the veterans. The men of Artois regroup. They charge back, but Labienus and the Romans hold them off. On another side of the hill, the 8th Legion and the 11th drive off the Viromandui, the men of Vermandois, and they pursue them as they flee. But elsewhere, it gets bad. The gradual movement of the battle, driving the Belgians from the hill and pursuing them, this leaves a big gap in the middle of the lines, and it exposes the camp. The Nervii themselves, with their great commander Boduognatus leading the charge, they force into the camp in a dense column, and they overrun it. The Nervii have taken the top of the hill, and then they wheel around and they start pressing down on the exposed flank of the 7th Legion and the 12th. Meanwhile, the camp attendants, the servants, and the slaves, they see the camp being overrun, and they think, it's over. The camp only gets taken after you lose a battle, right? And many of them panic and run. And then some of Caesar's other allied cavalry, they ride up, And all this time, by the way, his marching column of 50,000 soldiers and their equipment, it's still gradually trickling in. And the Belgae attacked right as the baggage train was beginning to arrive. And so these allied cavalry come up, and here's what they do. Caesar says, quote, "All these events alarmed certain horsemen of the Nervii, whose reputation for valor among the Gauls is unique. Their state had sent them to Caesar as auxiliaries, but when they saw our camp filled with the host of the enemy, our legions hard-pressed and almost surrounded in their grip, the camp attendants, horsemen, slingers, Numidians, sundered, scattered, and fleeing in all directions. In despair of our fortunes, they made haste for home, and reported to their state that the Romans were repulsed and overcome, and that the enemy had taken possession of their camp and baggage train." End quote. They think it's over. But as long as Caesar's still alive, it's never over. Here's what Caesar does now that the Nervii have taken the camp and they're pressing his right wing. Quote, "Caesar started for the right wing. There he beheld his troops hard driven, and the men of the 12th Legion with their standards collected in one place, so closely packed that they hampered each other for fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort of the Legion had been slain, and the standard-bearer likewise, and the standard itself was lost. Almost all the centurions of the other cohorts were either wounded or killed. Among them the chief centurion, Publius Sextius Baculus, bravest of the brave, who was overcome by many grievous wounds, so that he could no longer hold himself upright." End quote. And centurions, by the way, here are the sergeants, the NCOs, if you will, who've worked themselves up from the ranks by their skill and valor to lead a century. The century is not 100 men, as the names would sort of suggest, but at this point in history, a century is 60 men. There are 2 centuries in a maniple, 3 maniples in a cohort, and 10 cohorts in a legion. So do the math, and that's 60 centurions per legion. And so Caesar is noting very heavy casualties among his NCOs, his centurions. But as Adrian Goldsworthy notes, centurions led from the front, and they suffered disproportionately high casualties as a result in Roman battles. So how does Caesar inspire the loyalty of these men and these kind of brave men to stand their ground and fight? Well, imagine if you're Publius Sextius Baculus there, bravest of the brave, and Caesar records your name in his commentaries for posterity and for the cheering crowds in the forum to hear. Imagine getting a shout out like that. And even more importantly, listen to this. Quote, "The rest of the men were growing exhausted, and some of the rearmost ranks, abandoning the fight, were retiring to avoid the missiles. The enemy were continually forcing upwards from the lower ground in the front, and were also pressing hard on either flank. The condition of affairs, as Caesar saw, was on a knife's edge, and there was no support that could be sent up. Taking, therefore, a shield from a soldier of the rearmost ranks, as he himself had arrived without a shield, Caesar went forward up to the front line, and calling on the centurions by name, because he's taken the time to learn them all, right? And cheering on the rank and file, he bade them advance and spread out the ranks of their units, that they might use their swords more easily. His coming brought hope to the troops and renewed their spirit. Each man of his own accord, in sight of the commander-in-chief, desperate as his own case might be, was motivated to do his utmost. So the onslaught of the enemy was slowed down a little." End quote. This is what nobility looks like in action. It's practically the definition of aristocracy right there, leading from the front. Plutarch comments that in all probability the entire army of the Romans would have been destroyed there on that day had Caesar not done what he did. It would have been another Battle of Cannae or Arausio or Teutoburg Forest. Well, now that he's done his job there, Caesar's got to move on. Quote, "Perceiving that the 7th Legion, which had formed up near at hand, was also hard-pressed by the enemy, Caesar instructed the tribunes to close the legions gradually together, and then wheeling around to advance against the enemy. This was done. And as one soldier supported another, and now they did not fear that their rear would be surrounded by the enemy, they began to resist more boldly and to fight more bravely. Meanwhile, the soldiers of the 2 legions, which had acted as baggage guard at the rear of the column, this is his reserves, they heard the news of the action. So word is spreading through the column. They're still marching up. Pressing on with all speed, they became visible to the enemy on the crest of the hill. And Titus Labienus, having taken possession of the enemy's camp across the river and observed from the higher ground what was going on in our own camp, he sent the 10th Legion to support our troops. He sends them back across the river. When these learnt from the flight of the cavalry and the camp attendants about the state of affairs and the grave danger in which the camp, the legions, and the commander-in-chief were placed, they spared not a tittle of their speed. So Caesar's held the lines just long enough for reinforcements to come there, for the situation to change. Such an important lesson. So much of winning is just surviving long enough. Here's what happens next. Quote, "The arrival of these men brought a great change in the situation. Even such of our troops as had fallen under the stress of wounds propped themselves up on their shields and renewed the fight. Then the camp attendants, seeing the panic of the enemy, met their armed assault even without arms." These are the slaves and the servants, and they're joining the fray with pots and pans and tent poles and shovels. Finally, the cavalry. The cavalry, you'll recall, who was overrun across the river on the enemy's sudden surprise attack. The cavalry, to obliterate by valor the disgrace of their earlier flight, fought at every point in the effort to surpass the legionaries. But it's not going to be easy. And listen to this. Quote, "The enemy, however, even when their hope of safety was at an end, displayed prodigious courage. When their front ranks had fallen, the next stood on the prostrate bodies and fought from atop them. When these were cast down and the corpses were piled up in heaps, the survivors, standing as it were upon a mound, hurled darts down on our troops or caught and returned our pikes. Not without reason, therefore, was it to be concluded that these were men of a great courage, who had dared to cross a very broad river, to climb very high banks, and to press up over most unfavorable ground. These were tasks of utmost difficulty, but greatness of courage had made them seem easy." Well, after that, finally, the Belgian army is exhausted and annihilated, and Caesar is victorious. Here's the aftermath. Quote, "This engagement brought the name and nation of the Nervii almost to utter destruction. Upon report of the battle, the older men, who had been gathered with the women and the children in the creeks and the marshes, so they're a number of miles away, supposed that there was nothing to hinder the victors, nothing to save the vanquished. And so, with the consent of all the survivors, they sent deputies to Caesar and surrendered to him. In relating the disaster which had come upon their state, they declared that from 600 senators, they had been reduced to 3, and from 60,000 to barely 500 that could bear arms. To show himself merciful toward their pitiful suppliants, Caesar was most careful for their preservation. He bade them keep their own territory and towns, and commanded their neighbors to restrain themselves and their dependents from outrage and injury." End quote. So Caesar gets a chance here to exercise his famous clementia, his clemency. And I do think that we should pour out a libation in honor of these men, the bravest of the Belgae. But, before you mourn the destruction of the Nervii, don't worry, they'll be back in force for more mischief in later books. So Caesar may be exaggerating the extent of their destruction. But yes, that is the story of when Caesar, on a razor's edge, almost lost it all, but saved the situation by his personal bravery and his calm presence of mind. There's one final episode before this book closes that's worth mentioning. There's another tribe of Belgae that were on their way to join the Nervii when they heard the news of their destruction at the Battle of the Sabis River, which is what that battle came to be called. And that was the Aduatuci. So these guys retreat to a very well-fortified stronghold in their territory, and they refuse to surrender. And here's what happens when Caesar and his legions arrive to subdue them. Quote, "And now, upon the first arrival of our army, the Aduatuci made frequent sallies from the stronghold and engaged in petty encounters with our troops. Afterwards, when they had around them a fortified rampart 12 feet high with forts at close interval, they kept within their town. When our mantlets had been pushed up," these are the portable sheds, the vines, you remember, "and a ramp constructed, and they saw a tower set up in the distance, at first they laughed at us from the wall and loudly railed upon us for erecting so great an engine at so great a distance. 'By what handiwork,' said they, 'by what strength could men, especially of so puny a stature, hope to set so heavy a tower on the wall? For as a rule, our stature, short by comparison with their own huge physique, is despised by all the Gauls.'" End quote. So they're thumbing their noses. "You don't scare us, you Roman pig dogs." But then they see the tower moving towards them, slowly, inexorably, up the ramp. And they send out some emissaries to Caesar. And they offer to turn over the town, but they plead with him to let them keep their weapons. You see, not, of course, because they want to war with and resist the Romans, but they explain their neighbors are always warring with them and, they don't want to be left defenseless there. You have to remember, with these Gauls, taking all their weapons is like taking away all their golf clubs. It's a way of life. This is what these people do. But Caesar says, no way, got to give up those weapons. So they say fine, and they go back. And soon the Aduatuci start hurling their weapons over the wall of their fort into the ditch below. And Caesar says the growing pile of arms fills up the trench and eventually nearly reaches the wall of the city. So many weapons they had. Wow. And they let Caesar's guards into the city. It turns out, however, that was only about a third of their weapons, and they kept the rest concealed. And that night, Caesar has his guards retreat from the city to avoid any mischief. And, the Aduatuci, they break out and they try to storm and set fire to Caesar's camp. But the Romans defeat them utterly. And, once you break faith with the Romans, you lose all privileges. Caesar captures the city. Then he sells off all the living souls to the slave merchants that follow along with the camp. It's one of those sad, grim realities of war. Meanwhile, Caesar reports that he's received word from young Publius Crassus, who was actually sent out on a mission earlier in the book, and Crassus reports that with a mere 1 legion, he has gone and received the submission of all the Gallic tribes along the Atlantic. This is the Publius Crassus, again, the son of the richest man in Rome, the power broker, and Caesar's financier, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Publius, the brilliant young lieutenant who turned the tide of battle against Ariovistus back in Book 1, and also the one who, years later, fell in the great disaster at the Battle of Carrhae in Mesopotamia, next to his father, as we've told in Episode 3 of the Life of Crassus. Well then, as Caesar says, with all Gaul pacified by these successes, news spreads around and emissaries from other tribes come and they offer him pledges of fealty. Caesar stations his troops in winter quarters in Gaul, once again, of course, and he heads back to Illyricum to do his governor business in the off-season. And very noteworthy here, he closes the book with the following report. For these accomplishments, based on a report of Caesar, a public thanksgiving of 15 days was decreed at Rome, which had never been done for anyone before. End quote. So this public celebration, this Thanksgiving, was of course declared by the Roman Senate. Everybody in the city gets 15 days of vacation time. Pompey, only got a mere 10-day Thanksgiving after defeating Mithridates. And so this is a point of pride for Caesar. But It also meant that the Senate was, in effect, ratifying all of his legally dubious actions in Gaul over the past 2 years. So this is a huge political win on the home front. But as we know, judging by the fact that we have 6 more books left in the commentaries, all of Gaul was far from pacified. More on that next time. If you enjoyed this, please tell a friend, leave a comment, leave us a good review. It really helps people find this material and get inspired to live their best ancient life now. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.